Hello and a very warm welcome to the Ideas Factory. I am Naghma. Joining is Professor Pant. On this episode of the Ideas Factory, few of the big questions that we would be looking at is number one, the condition in Afghanistan, which continues to be very, very severe because Afghanistan is actually facing or on the verge of a humanitarian crisis with inflation, soaring high inflation, as well as an economic crisis. Along with that, the infighting within the Taliban and the challenges of governance. While all this is happening, the people in general are going through a very, very difficult time. So, we will look at Afghanistan and the questions arising out of Afghanistan. Other than that, we will, of course, be looking at the SCO summit that took place and what are the big questions or what are the big challenges that face the SCO and the AUKUS deal. These are some of the big points that we will be looking at along with your questions. A very warm welcome to you, Harsh, and let's begin with Afghanistan. Though the Taliban spokespersons have been denying for a long time that there is no rivalry, no friction within the Taliban, no infighting, we know things are not okay. And now it's out in the open that Mullah Baradar has been sidelined. In fact, there are reports of a fist fight and shootout in the palace. This was a fear forever that the Taliban, though they captured Kabul with lightning speed, they will not be able to manage, and governance is a very, very, very big question. So, the question is the only moderate voice or face that the West had hoped for has been sidelined, which means that the Pakistani imprint is very much or very evident there. What does it really mean, the first of all, the infighting and how the Haqqanis have actually taken over and have sidelined Mullah Baradar, who was once jailed in Pakistan, of course, but he seemed as the more moderate voice who was talking of an inclusive government, giving place to the minorities too.
None of this is actually surprising if we knew the where the Taliban are coming from. But I think what is you know even under normal circumstances, from this movement from war fighting to giving some kind of a politically legitimate government is a very difficult task. Political, government formation at the political level is always often more tortuous than war fighting. But in this case, we have had Taliban and the affiliated organizations with one agenda. They wanted to drive out the Americans, and they succeeded in it. But beyond that, because that agenda was the most important variable in their attempt to define uh, you know their progress and their achievements. Uh, the the thought that needed to be given perhaps for what would happen the day after. I think those questions were clearly not on the minds of most people, even on, I think, on those in those countries, in particular in Pakistan, that were trying to control the trajectory of Taliban and how they uh, undertook this entire mission. So I think it was inevitable that very soon we would find the fissures out in the open, as we are now looking at. And I think in this particular case, you had the Mullah Baradar, who had been projected as the moderate face by the West. He was the one who was dealing with the West throughout the last decade, and in some ways giving this idea some legitimacy that perhaps this is a new Taliban, that perhaps Taliban had evolved, that perhaps their agenda would be about governance. And look how fast and how swiftly the charade has been completely taken. It is now out in the open. So I think for a large part of the narrative, that was about inclusive government, that was about that this would be about a new kind of approach to governance and to ordinary Afghans. Nothing of that is coming out. Of course, Mullah Baradar's marginalization is now out in the open, but also the steps that have been taken, whether it is in terms of keeping girls out of secondary schools, or just renaming the women's department in the women's welfare division in the government. Everything that is happening now is very, very predictable, and is very Taliban 1.0, if one can call it that. So clearly, the marginalization of Mullah Baradar is one more evidence, if at all is needed, and that I think turbulence lies ahead, both in terms of the inability of various factions within Taliban to come together and frame a cohesive agenda, as well as in terms of the evolution of the Taliban, about which we have been discussing for months now. That something of that, there was a possibility that something along those lines could have happened, but clearly we now know that nothing of that kind is happening. On the ground, the situation is bleak, and I think at this particular point, which something that you mentioned, the economic crisis is raising its head in a very, very ugly way, which one doesn't know whether those who are in control of the reins of power in Taliban are actually even aware of how swiftly the situation can get out of control if the economic crisis that is brewing, is not actually brought under control.
Uh, all right, like you mentioned, this is clearly not Taliban 2.0, it's Taliban 1.0. Everything seems to be as brutal, as regressive as it was earlier, of course, in terms of women's rights. But when women's rights comes a little later than human rights, because people are really not getting food to eat. There is a huge economic crisis looming there. China and Pakistan now are raising voice over how America should unfreeze the assets of Afghanistan. But you see all this happening, and what would be the reaction of the Western powers or the United Nations looking at the humanitarian crisis, but also looking at what's happening within Afghanistan, the infighting, the factionalism, Taliban actually being the original Taliban. So they're not really living up to any of the promises that they actually made. What would be, or what is the future that we're looking at for the Afghan people?
Well, Pakistan and China will certainly push and push harder insofar as uh, yeah, yeah, the issue of legitimacy is concerned, recognition is concerned. They would want that as soon as possible, the West should legitimize this government or give some kind of recognition to the government in Kabul. But what is happening on the ground, I think, would perhaps give the West and other stakeholders much more room to think carefully about how they want to proceed. Because initially, in the initial euphoria, in the initial conversations that one was looking at, you saw that there was a sense that perhaps this was a Taliban that the West in particular could do business with. And that doesn't seem to be at the moment very feasible and very logical. If you see the debate in the West, it is turning against Taliban. The more the regressive policies are out in the open, the more the humanitarian crisis raises its ugly head. I think the challenges for the West would be where to draw the line in providing humanitarian aid to the people of Afghanistan who really need help, and not at the same time legitimizing the government in Kabul, legitimizing Taliban in Kabul, because at the end of the day, it is the Taliban that would be governing or that would be distributing that aid in some way. That would be in their hands, and so it's a tricky situation for, I think, a lot of the external stakeholders. I think we have seen that challenge even UN is facing, that every time they go and meet the Taliban representatives, they are giving one more stamp of legitimacy to that particular government or to that particular organization. But the more things do not change in Afghanistan in terms of policies, in terms of the way the governance model is operating, I think it would become even more difficult for international stakeholders to move forward in a manner that allows perhaps ordinary Afghans to get some help from the international community, which I think is certainly needed, and in some shape should get there. But I think that modus vivendi will have to be worked out very, very carefully, because it can then, if not done properly, then it can come back to haunt the international community very soon. Because if that is not used properly, if ordinary Afghans continue to suffer economically, socially, and politically, then I think the question would be, why was it done in such a manner? So I think at this particular point, the West is in a tricky situation. The international community itself is in a tricky situation. But I do not see any great move towards legitimizing or recognizing the present government. I think everyone will give some more time and see what happens in Afghanistan, because even the limited time that we have had so far has given us, a greater sense of perhaps how fragile the political environment is in Kabul.
The political environment is really, really fragile in Kabul. But at the SCO summit, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization summit that took place, Prime Minister Modi raised this concern of radicalization as the biggest challenge that the world faces, and spoke of Afghanistan. He spoke of radicalization in the context of Afghanistan. And after that, the Pakistani Prime Minister also has made statements about reaching out to the Taliban and talking to them. There is a question that has also come in from one of our viewers, Akshay Pandit, who raises this question: that is the SCO a relevant organization in terms of its stated objective of fighting extremism and terrorism? And then, of course, he points towards China and Pakistan being part of the SCO and says the perpetrator of terrorism and its iron brother are both members, and arson cannot become firefighter. So, in a way, he's questioning the relevance of SCO in dealing with radicalization or fighting with radicalization. How do you see the proposals made at the SCO summit in dealing with the situation that's arising, especially after the turn of events in Afghanistan?
Yes, in an ideal world, SEO today would be the most important platform to manage the turbulence in Afghanistan, because you have all the neighbors of Afghanistan present. You have a very important players like Russia, China, India present. You have Central Asia present. You have Pakistan and Iran present. So I think Iran, by the way, joined during this session as full member of the SCO. So I think clearly, if there is any platform that can give voice not only to the aspirations of of ordinary Afghans, but also to the aspirations of regional powers, it is SCO. But that is an ideal world, and so if you look at the joint statement from SCO, it talks about all the nice things that all these countries want, and are trying to strive for. But when you come to realpolitik, it's a different matter. And I think I thought that the Prime Minister's statement, Indian Prime Minister's statement there, was particularly important because he was in some ways very, very categorical about the things that India expects SCO to do. And this is the 20th year of the SCO's establishment. SCO, when it was conceived 20 years back, it was conceived as a platform that could manage radicalization, extremism, terrorism in Central Asia and around. And I think that's why Prime Minister Modi made it a point to talk about the challenge that SCO faces today, uh, both in terms of its ability to garner more support, as well as in terms of its ability to sustain its longevity and and the support from regional stakeholders. Is that unless the threat of radicalization is managed better by SCO, the point that Akshay is raising perhaps in his question becomes very relevant, that it would have no future, because at the end of the day, what SCO was designed for, at the end of the day, what regional powers want is that some sort of a control over extremism, terrorism, radicalization in the region. And if that is not happening, then what's the point of having such an organization? And Prime Minister, I thought, was very, very categorical about this, because he linked it to this idea that and I think this was the first time from India that we had such a statement, saying that in Afghanistan we don't have an inclusive government. And so we should really wait and watch. We should not move forward in recognizing the government in Taliban. That was very categorical, and I think he linked this idea with the inability of SCO to manage radicalization and extremism. And I would just add one more point here, which I think he mentioned, which was directed towards China, which was an interesting one in terms of connectivity, where he said that India and Central Asia want greater connectivity, and India is open for greater connectivity, but connectivity on whose terms? And there he, underscored those principles of
Yes.
participation, of bottom-up projects, of this idea that it has to respect sovereignty of countries. All those issues that are inherent in China's approach to connectivity, all those issues that are not inherent in China's approach to connectivity. So he was trying to delineate a response which is distinct from the Chinese approach, and making it clear to the region that India wants connectivity, but connectivity on a set of different ideas and principles, which I think was an important point to be made at this fora, where China is such an important player, and China certainly has had greater success in making inroads in Central Asia.
Yes, absolutely. He very clearly stated that connectivity has to be a two-way traffic. It cannot be just one way. So he very clearly stated that it has to be different from what China actually imagines in uh, connectivity to be. Another question that comes up this week, Hutch, is the AUKUS deal or the AUKUS pact. What does it really mean to India, or what does it signify to India, is one aspect of it. But also, of course, we know that France is upset about it and has condemned the US and Australia for actually over the security pact, and unilaterally scuttling the $50 billion deal with the naval group. But the fact is that the rapidly building Chinese navy need a strong response. That is also a point that is coming up. So how do you see this, and what does this AUKUS deal signal to India?
Well, I think this pact is certainly raises a number of questions. Some things that I think we all should be much more. We should be thinking about much more, and should be really looking at it from a much broader perspective than simply this being a defense deal amongst three countries, because this sends out so many messages at so many levels to so many stakeholders in the region, that it is very important to not to see this as primarily a trilateral pact. This is, at the end of the day, America's way of coming back into the game in the Indo-Pacific, from which it has been missing. And I think we can link it to our discussion on Afghanistan, that there has been this big debate about America and about American commitments post its withdrawal from Afghanistan. And that if America, could do this to Afghanistan, what's the guarantee of American commitments that it is making to its Indo-Pacific partners and allies? And I think by with this pact, AUKUS pact, it sounds awkward, but it is what it is. Australia, UK, US pact, which is basically giving critical sensitive technology like submarine technology, nuclear power submarine technology to Australia, signifies that something dramatically shifting in America's approach to the region, and in the way regional players are willing to step up to the game. Because it's a twofold, something that you mentioned earlier. It's a two-way street. America is willing now to supply this kind of sensitive technology to an Indo-Pacific partner of Washington's. And UK is part of this relationship. This is, first of all, this is nuclear technology that is being supplied to a country that is a non-nuclear country, Australia. And there have been some criticisms on that count as well, as to what does it do to the nuclear non-proliferation architecture. And so it is in some ways, also interestingly, one can look at it through the prism of US-India nuclear deal, where America went ahead and supplied civil nuclear technology to India through that arrangement. But of course, India was not a signatory to the NPT, or is not a signatory to the NPT. Australia is. But I think beyond that, what it shows is that America is today willing to provide such technologies to its partners, willing to empower its partners in the Indo-Pacific to take on greater share of of the responsibility, and that Australia is willing to take that responsibility. And I think that is very important. That Australia, we always had, have had this conversation about Australia's dependence on China, but I think this is something that is Australia has gone out of its way to now make it very, very clear that Australia's relations with China are on a completely different trajectory today than they were even, say, a year back. And there is no going back from this. And Australia is now firmly embedded in the American, in the regional security architecture. And we will see what it shows is that this is just the beginning. Given the changes in the Indo-Pacific, we are going to see more innovative attempts and ideas. We have already seen, for example, a number of things, a number of trilaterals, including the quadrilateral, which we will talk about more next week when the quadrilateral in-person meet happens in the US. But I think what it shows is that innovation is the name of the game in Indo-Pacific at a time when Chinese power is rising and other powers are really trying to manage this power transition. And given that the capability differential is so huge, I think increasingly we will see America engaging with its like-minded partners in the region in a way that we have not heard before or we have not seen before. So I think this is just the initial step in that direction, a very important step, and I think a step that will have implications not only for Australia, US, and the UK, but also for other countries in the region that are trying to devise their own strategies vis-a-vis China.
Absolutely. Given the changes in the Indo-Pacific, this is just the beginning, like you said, and innovation is the name of the game. A lot of countries are trying to respond to the new challenges that are emerging in the Indo-Pacific because of China. And but like you said, there is a big question, or a trust deficit as far as America is concerned. Its allies now look at America with that, in that context because of what happened in Afghanistan. So that also raises a question. But that's it we have time for on this episode of the Ideas Factory. We will be tracking all the developments in the international arena for the next week too. But for today, this is all from us. Thank you so much for joining and watching, and you can send us your questions. We'll try to take in as many questions as possible. Thank you so much, Harsh.